Tell me what you pay attention to, and I will tell you who you are. Those are words by the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset. I'm intrigued by this quote by the savvy thinker. He followed so many roads in search of truth and understanding, and I consider him to be an imaginal ancestor. Despite his death in 1955, would he be able to tell me who I am from his current realm? Every experience exists in a context that is far larger than that of the physical realm. There is always a personal memory realm, a historical realm, a biological realm, a psychological realm, an imaginal realm, a spiritual realm, and realms unknown. From the web of these relationships, I choose to see the causes and effects of experiences as synchronous and mythological, rather than as random coincidences. Mythology is the archetypal chain of associations which gives coherence and connectivity to these realms and moves me toward sacred mystery. When one interprets an experience mythologically, the experience opens with an enormous vitality and a sense of purpose and understanding. Is there a conscious reciprocity between other entities and me? Or is what I see as synchronicity merely coincidence? Ultimately, I make that decision. A mythological interpretation does not ignore the facts of an experience. If I'm wrong, so be it. My mythological interpretations give me more purpose, humility, vitality, and satisfaction in those relationships. On the summer solstice of 1989, I sat in prayer on a hill in Sage Creek wilderness of the Badlands. After years of curiosity about indigenous practices, I felt driven to fast and pray in the South Dakota wilderness. I did not know any medicine men, nor did I have a savvy elder to sit by a fire and guide me, or explain why or what I might be doing. I was on my own. On my second day on the hill, a bull buffalo appeared across the draw about 50 feet from my patch of ground beneath a juniper. He settled beside another juniper and sat for about an hour until I saw his head turn toward the east, and I looked too. A hiker was a half-mile away with a German shepherd-like dog. The buffalo rose the way my gramps used to, slowly, and he walked behind the round juniper. He never reappeared on the opposite side of that tree, nor had he doubled back. He disappeared. I felt baffled and blessed. In the middle of the night, 3 lightning storms approached from the distant west. I was alone. No one knew where I had traveled to in the Badlands. With a wife and children back in St. Paul, I thought, I can't risk being struck by lightning while 8 hours from home. I left the hill. Something was coming, and it was more powerful than what my abilities could handle. As I walked back to my truck in the pitch dark, I suddenly stopped without thinking. I looked down and barely saw the rim of a Sage Creek cutbank. Any fall would have been 20 feet straight down. After readjusting my eyes, I located a buffalo path 5 feet to my right angling down the side of the cut bank. When I finally climbed into my pickup truck, the rain and hail began. I fell asleep and woke at dawn with a dream world voice announcing, "Bendigeidfran, Bendigeidfran." I knew it to be the name of an ancient Welsh king mentioned in the tales of the Mabinogi, but at the time I could not remember the tale. I've regularly revisited the Badlands and the Sage Creek wilderness with my wife, Dallas. 31 years after my first trip, we arrived again. A herd of buffalo grazed on either side of the road as we entered the campground. The sun had set, and all of the campsites were occupied. We parked our minivan on the edge of the campground, then enjoyed the half moon, the evening star, the North Star, and the two bears. As we lay down to sleep, Dallas said that the herd was moving eastward in the dark. Her eyes are sharper than mine, and I couldn't see them. We would wait until morning to claim a campsite abandoned by a transient camper. At 4:30 a.m., we awoke with lightning displaying in the west. The distant thunder rumbled like an old cow who reminds calves to stay nearby. Eventually the rain came, easy and gentle, a feminine rain. After the rain stopped and the sun began to rise, one bull walked out of a draw between two hills to the west. He ambled into the campground, crossed the prairie dog town, crossed the road at the south end, and disappeared below a rise. We did not know where the herd had wandered to. Once the bull had disappeared, an odd, wizard-looking man packed his gear into his off-road vehicle with its oversized tires, and he abandoned his campsite. We claimed the site and set up our camp. Beneath the picnic table, I found a bone, a strand of bison fur threaded through the sere bone's cord hole, and the fur sprayed out of the hole like wings. 3 chert stones lay beside it, discarded and out of place on the dry ground. Because extreme heat was forecast, we decided to drive to the town of Wall for ice. 12 miles from camp, a small buffalo group grazed beside the north road as others spilled up onto the flat prairie overlooking the valley. From the expansive rolling valley, more of the herd climbed over the lip and onto the gravel road. We drove slowly among them at the pace of a grazing cow, and we enjoyed their calm presence. Bulls, cows, and calves. Some youngsters were suckling for reassurance in the presence of our black metallic bulk. A few bulls and a few cows dropped in a dusty wallow, rolled, and kicked up their legs to let us know of their irritation. In October 1985, one day after a conference in Minnesota with the poet Robert Bly, and 3 months before my son's birth, I kicked up a 4,000 to 6,000-year-old bison humerus bone from the gravel graded onto my family's cabin road. The gravel came from a floodplain quarry beside the Woodland River where I had hunted and fished with my father and brothers. Synchronicity and sacredness are my only explanations for the electrical charge I still feel from the coil of those relationships, relationships connected across thousands of years. I am an anomaly in the 21st century. I have lived a herd life. As the eldest of 11 Catholic children, All but our dead brother are married with growing families. With our 39 children, stepchildren, nieces and nephews, and their 50 children in the next generation, the grandchildren, step-grandchildren, great-nieces and nephews, with our 75 first cousins married with their own growing families, with their children and grandchildren, with our large holiday feasts, large weddings, reunions, and funerals, I enjoy herd life. I can comfortably relate to the bison herd's behavior. At times, I wander off to be alone on a hill like a bison bull. 4 years after kicking up the humerus, I met that first wild bull in the Sage Creek wilderness, and we sat with one another. A few years later, while reading Joseph Epps Brown's book, The Animals of the Soul, I learned that black elk and the Oglala people, whose lands include the Badlands and Sage Creek wilderness, revered the buffalo as, quote, the chief of all animals representing the earth, the totality of all that is, unquote. The old cows, not the bulls, act as leaders of the herd and are the model for the womanly virtues. In the bulls, a, quote, masculine pole to the earthly qualities was discerned, unquote. They protect the calves against predators and encircle sleeping cows and calves at night. These herd duties are quite familiar to me. Brown also provided me with the phrase, quote, an unlikely chain of association, unquote, which describes how various life forms mysteriously connect with each other and with formless powers, divine powers, mythological powers, and life's inner powers of virtue and understanding. After lunch, Dallas and I tried to walk into the dramatic geology of the Badlands. Without a breeze, the heat was oppressive, and we returned to our campsite. I strung a tarp for shade, and we quietly absorbed the day. I wrote, and Dallas read Willa Cather. In the evening, we walked up a western hill above the draw from where the bull emerged that morning. Wary, Dallas watched for rattlesnakes. Near some juniper, we found 2 spots which looked eastward over the rolling, grassy wilderness. The sky was fading blue to gray. According to her meditation, Dallas needed to pray from a hilltop and walked on. I sat beside a juniper tree and filled a pipe with tobacco, the pipe I had made in the years following my first time on the hill. As a younger man, I had hitchhiked or walked or drove to wild places for comfort and reverence in a natural environment. In 1984, I met a woman who used such a pipe only to smoke marijuana. When I suggested she respect the original purpose of the pipe, she simply gave me the pipe. A couple years later, someone stole it from my car with a bag of poems and anthropology books. The books and bag were found in a trash can. The pipe was not. One of the many reasons I chose to sit on a Badlands hill was to atone for any misuse or naivete by either the previous owners or myself. At that time, I didn't know anyone, indigenous or not, who had any knowledge of how such things should be handled. I had only read about such things, but I felt a deep pull to the Badlands in South Dakota, where my grandfather was born. After World War I, Gramps worked as a cowboy and rode fence for the Diamond T Ranch with a Sioux pal from the Cheyenne River Reservation. They met in a French hospital where they recuperated from mustard gas poisoning. Gramps told me of his fascination for the few Sioux ceremonies he witnessed, which were illegal at that time. He, his brother and sister, also told me that their great-grandmother was a Mohawk woman from upstate New York. Her son, my grandfather's grandfather, scouted for a wagon train that traveled from St. Joseph, Missouri to California during the gold rush of 1849. The tale of a blood ancestor who was half Indian and a wagon train scout thrilled me. I had hoped that someday I might find that part of my family. When I was a small boy and visited relatives in South Dakota, I waited to meet my Indian relatives, but never did. Eventually, 2 DNA analyses indicated that I have no American Indian blood at all. However, with that information, documented census information, and with my family's lore, it's reasonable to assume that because my wagon train scout ancestor's biological mother died before he was a year old, his father took a second wife, probably a local Mohawk woman who raised my great-great-grandfather as her own. As I prayed beneath the juniper, I asked for blessings and protections for my relatives and loved ones. I asked for help to continue the inner spiritual work I had begun long ago. I sat cross-legged and dropped into an alpha state of mind. As I smoked, I put the tail of the pipe on the ground. It felt right, and the stem reached to my lips in a comfortable way. When I finished, Dallas and I walked back to the camp by separate paths. Clouds covered the sun and spread southward. I thought that any storm would bypass our camp. To the far south, lightning began, a continuous sequence of flashing balls, rippling light, and throbbing clouds. Eventually, we heard thunder rumble. I wondered if something strong was happening at Pine Ridge. The flashing clouds soon filled with explosive streaks and waving cracks and heavy cloud-to-earth lightning bolts. The storm approached slowly from the south, although it seemed to be moving south. Around 9 p.m., the storm was overhead with fierce lightning, overwhelming thunder, and a sudden torrential rain. The rain continued and then abated about 3 a.m. As the thunder and lightning grew distant, the wind accelerated on the backside of the weather front. It was strong, 50 to 70 miles per hour. I had to take down the snapping shade tarp over the picnic table canopy. My eyes squinted as I clumsily unknotted the ropes. Wet grit pummeled me. I was being sandblasted. 20 minutes later, the wind suddenly and completely ceased. In Joseph Epps Brown's books, I found new explanations for the relationships between native people and the animals in their environment. He wrote how animals can guide us in our care for our own people and the earth. In Animals of the Soul, he shows how the Oglala connect the bison to the power of the whirlwind, the little brother of the four winds. This brother is beloved by the wife of the south wind. She is associated with White Buffalo Calf Woman, who brought the sacred pipe to the Lakota. She also taught the Oglala how to make ceremony, how to pray, and how to live virtuously. After giving out her instructions, she transformed into a buffalo and promised to return as a bringer of spiritual peace and harmony. In his essay, Tawny Grammar, Published in 1990, the poet Gary Snyder wrote that, quote, "In this old Occidental culture, our teaching elders are books. Books are our grandparents," unquote. My personal grandparents were not readers. Like many landless Americans, they struggled from one work experience to another work experience, and they had little interest or time for matters beyond our family's history and survival. On the other hand, the post-World War II American culture provided enough economic security and education that a working-class child like me could immerse himself in books. What I could not get from my family, I found at the library, or later, affordable paperbacks. Snyder wrote in the same essay, quote, "An excited and deep study of antiquity is akin to an apprenticeship with traditional elders," unquote. Without personal elders to query, I sought answers in books. I lived my apprenticeship. Poetry and essays by the likes of Gary Snyder, Wendell Berry, and Robert Bly reinforced my trust and experience in the physical, emotional, imaginal, mythological realms. Through their mythological study and practices, my grandparents of the books have added deeper perspectives to my experiences. The whirlwind battered me, and because of Brown's words, I felt the sandblasting was a ritual purification. For another hour the storm galloped away, and the eastern horizon swallowed the lightning mushrooms. The half-moon had set, and stars reappeared in a cobalt sky. I experienced the storms I had eluded in 1989. We slept peacefully and woke to a beautiful morning. Despite my feelings about the commercialization of Crazy Horse's visage, we drove to visit Custer State Park and the Crazy Horse Memorial. I am not a warrior type, but I have an affinity for Crazy Horse. Whenever he needed to understand his duty to his people, he went alone to pray in the Badlands. In Custer State Park, another herd of buffalo entertained our crowd of automobile tourists. Later, while Dallas and I ate lunch in a quiet gravel parking lot, she casually mentioned that Custer Park's buffalo seemed smaller than the buffalo in the Badlands. We gazed at the mountainous, incomplete sculpture of Crazy Horse. The ravaged mountain was disgraced, and the crass commercialism of Crazy Horse Memorial Grounds dictated our swift walk-through and departure. When we returned to the Sage Creek wilderness, the herd of buffalo that had disappeared the night before were grazing on the far side of the creek. We walked over the dry creek bed, climbed a bison path angling up the cut bank, then stood in the prairie grass about 100 yards from the snorting, rumbling, and grunting beasts. I am no longer shy about speaking aloud to non-humans. I addressed the herd in a quiet, conversational tone, and I thanked them for coming back to this prairie before we had to leave the next morning. We returned 500 yards to the camp. Throughout the evening, with my binoculars steadying on the bank of a camp chair, I watched the herd of 200-plus graze and slowly move along the base of the far hills. One bull and a female seemed to be courting, sniffing and nuzzling, shivering and twitching with sexual electricity. They seemed to be letting the herd move on without them. A small calf romped nearby, but when it got too close, it darted away as if shooed or threatened. The couple dawdled as the herd moved on. The calf seemed to say, "Come on, Mom, we need to catch up." It did not make a difference. Courting continued for 3/4 of an hour as the herd grazed and moved thousands of yards. The calf unexpectedly darted up a hill toward a group of about a dozen who had not gone south on the flats. Was one of them Grandma? A sibling? Was the smitten cow truly the calf's mother? Or was the calf just a nosy kid? Suddenly, the entire herd turned and stampeded back to where the love-struck couple danced. A slight tremor spread all the way to the campground, and a huge cloud of dust lifted over the racing beasts. What caused them to rush? Were they spooked? Did they act as a moral authority and impose a bison code on a cow whose calf was too young to be chased away? This calf was the smallest among the many calves. The herd stopped its rush and surrounded the couple. Raucous bellows, grunting, and agitated noises lasted for about 5 minutes, and I could not tell which bull and cow I had been watching. Did the herd sense my voyeurism? The dust settled, and they began to graze in peace. A few head trotted down the cut bank, where we had climbed to the prairie. More and more of the herd crossed the creek on various paths as dusk thickened to dark. By 9 p.m., most of the herd grazed on the flats between the creek and the campground. They were slowly moving toward me as I sat on the van's side door sill. Dallas had gone to the outhouse, and when she came out with her lantern, some buffalo were walking on the camp road 5 feet from the outhouse door. She could hear their fur rustling and their hooves scratching gravel. She could smell them as the dark, moving morass curled over the side of the road and slowly turned away from her. She ran from the gravel road to the center of the campground. Meanwhile, the cows and bulls who approached me stopped 10 yards away at the campground's edge and bent their heads to graze again. If necessary, I would have slid into the van. I thanked them for the privilege of their visit, and I asked them if they were descendants of the bull who shared an hour with me 31 years ago. Their slow, cautious movements were like reintroductions to long-lost kin. I was energized. It's good to share experiences with such vivifying beings. The moon shined through the night, and the temperature dropped to 43 degrees. 2 days before, it had been 95 and too hot to walk the shapely landscapes. Because we needed the entire day to drive home, we left before sunrise. As we drove the Badlands loop, small groups of bulls sat quietly away from the road. They absorbed the clear dawn, like the calm old man I saw in a chair overlooking the Yukon River's Minto Flats in 1978. He had greeted the sunrise in a whispery Athabascan. At separate Badlands overlooks, 2 bulls scratched themselves against the parking lot's upright posts. Each post reached just high enough for a good belly rub and a head scratch. The mood reminded me of those mornings with my uncles at my dad's cabin. Dallas and I slowed and greeted the bulls, then we said goodbye until we could return to Sage Creek Wilderness with greetings from our large extended family in Minnesota. Bendigeidfran was Bran the Blessed. As he was dying on a battlefield in Ireland, He told the 7 survivors of his army to cut his head from his body and carry it back to the Isle of the Mighty. He told them they would first spend 7 years in Harlech and then 80 years in Pembroke. There, they kept his head inside the great hall. He continued to talk and laugh with them, and they did not know the passage of time. He had warned, however, that when someone opened the door that faced Cornwall, the vivid memories of war's slaughter and loss would return. The grief would rush in. He would no longer talk, and his head would have to be buried at London. When the door opened after 87 years, the assembly of the noble head traveled to London, buried his head, and dispersed. I have wondered why the name Bendigeidfran arrived in that dream 31 years ago. The realm of dreams has been familiar to me. I have logged my dreams for decades and pondered their meanings for my life. The dead have returned to me in dreams. The future hinted of itself through dreams imagery. The resolution of problems occurred while I dreamt of other things. My wife and I continue to discuss our dreams, and I have encouraged my children and grandchildren to talk of their dreams. Dreams emerge from the unknown and can be markers for the soul, the way certain genes are markers for family origins. But the messages from the Bendigeidfran dream voice have eluded me. Through DNA analyses, I've learned that my ancestry goes back at least 24 generations to the British Isles, and I bear DNA markers that reach back at least 19 generations to Ortega y Gasset's beloved Iberia. But the percentage of my Irish Isle and Mighty Isle roots is higher than the percentage of my roots to any other earthly location. Could the story of Bendigeidfran be so deep in my ancestral memory that it could finally rise to mind after fasting? Did that dream voice indicate a relationship to an ancestral head that could serve my spiritual work? In Celtic mythology, the head is the seat of the soul. The Jungian writer, John Layard, said that, quote, the head represents the spiritual phallus, unquote. It is a symbol of the spirit transcending the duality of life and death. If my DNA carries that belief, and if dreams carry that belief, the name of this Welsh king is an instructive illumination. The seat of my soul may be in my head, and its contents may live on beyond me. Since my first time sitting on the hill in the Sage Creek wilderness, I have deepened my work in story, mythology, poetry, and family. I am who I am through the interpretation of those relationships. If the analysis of my DNA is accurate, I am connected through generations to various places on earth, from Northern Europe to Gujarat and Rajasthan, from Sri Lanka to Puerto Rico, from Minnesota to Bengal, from Scandinavia to the Philippines. Only when I give attention to those places, their myths, music, and poetry, am I able to have relationships with those parts of my soul. Without that attention, without learning about my family roots, without the music resonating in my body memory, none of those relationships would exist. I am in those relationships. I am in the Irish poetry of County Mayo, in the stories from South Dakota's soil, and in the violin music crying in southern Slavic valleys. I am in the sweaty smell of a St. Paul meat shop, in the wet juice of Austrian grapevines, in the mane of a pinto quarter horse in Wisconsin. I am in Gujarati eyes, in the herring breath of a Scudisness granny, and in the grunts of Badlands bison. I am who I am in the smile of my grandson before he climbs the beanstalk. I am in the twinkly grin of my tricky granddaughter when she leans in with a kiss. I am who I am on a hill with a wisp of blue smoke lifting toward the clouds before the rain comes, before the thunder beings talk, before the holy powers of enormous mothers greet me and remind me that I am who I am within them, and I am obligated to all of them.